This is the VAXEE Outset AX wireless, a refreshed wireless version of the original Outset. Now I actually have quite a history with this mouse, as the wired version of the Outset was the first ever professional gaming mouse I ever bought, and I absolutely loved that mouse, but unfortunately I killed it after a failed cable mod attempt. And ever since then I've been really wanting to try the wireless version of the Outset, mostly because I've always loved the shape, but I haven't gotten my hands on one until now. Now admittedly, the Outset AX wireless is an older mouse from a spec perspective, as it's a bit dated compared to more modern mice, but VAXEE has built a reputation for themselves for exceptional build quality, consistency, and performance even on their older models. So I'm very curious to see how the AXW stacks up against more newer releases, and how the mouse's unique ergo shape feels now that I've tried so many different shapes. So in today's episode of the mel0n Review, we're going to take a deep dive into the VAXEE Outset AX wireless and talk about the mouse's pros and cons and how it performs in 2025. But before we get started, if you enjoy this review and want to see more content like this, including a full teardown of the Outset AX and an in-depth review of the VAXEE E1, make sure to leave a like on this video and get subscribed to the channel. And if you want to support what I do here on the channel with these in-depth reviews, teardowns, and guides, consider becoming a channel member, as it is the best way to directly support the channel and it gives you early access to all upcoming content. But with that said, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. For testing parameters, I used the Outset AXW for roughly 3 months on and off, used the mouse for both work and gaming use on a variety of soft and hard pad types. And since my unit was purchased secondhand and unfortunately didn't include the stock skates, I primarily used aftermarket skates throughout my testing, namely the X-Ray Pad U9 8mm dot skates along with the 9.5mm Jade and Obsidian Air donut skates. And for firmware, I tested the AXW on the V1.0.0 release, which was the latest version available at the time of this review. For versions, as expected for a VAXEE mouse, the Outset AXW comes in black, white, pink, yellow, blue, and orange colorways, the same colorways the mel0n wireless were available in. All these colorways retail for the same price, retailing for $129.99 USD. Now a quick preface before we get into this segment. Since my unit is secondhand, it is missing a few accessories, including the stock skates and some of the other original packaging components, so keep this in mind, as a brand new AXW will include a few additional items I won't be listing here. Now starting off with packaging, the mouse comes in VAXEE's signature style minimalist packaging, the same packaging style we saw used on the mel0n wireless I reviewed a couple months ago. Inside you'll find the mouse itself, which normally comes with full-size PTFE skates pre-installed, a USB A to C cable with VAXEE's signature pronged USB-C connector, which is very unique as it's designed to help anchor the cable into the mouse, preventing disconnecting issues, but we'll talk more about this unique connector later in this video. And tucked on the inside of the packaging on the bottom here is the mouse's 4K receiver. Now the receiver itself is a very lightweight dongle with a small rubber base on it that does a decent job of keeping it in place on most desktop surfaces, but heavier cables such as the mouse's stock cable can easily tug it around. This is one area I'd love to see VAXEE improve on their future releases, as adding a little bit of weight to the receiver, similar to what Pulsar and Razer has done with their dongles, would help anchor the dongle a little better and prevent it from being displaced by the heavier stock cables. And lastly, at the bottom of the box, there's a small insert with a QR code that links to the mouse's user manual. And since this is a wireless version, just like the mel0n wireless, the mouse is fully compatible with VAXEE's excellent WebDriver, so you won't need to rely on the onboard controls anymore, though you still can use them if you prefer, and having that QR code readily available is a nice touch, especially if you ever need a quick refresher on the mouse's rather complicated onboard functions. And lastly, for warranty coverage, the Outset AXW comes with a 1-year warranty provided by VAXEE, and you can find all the terms and conditions for said warranty on their website. Now for in-game performance, given my history with the Outset AX, going back to this older shape and design was a nice nostalgia trip for me, and to my surprise, the shape still holds up incredibly well and remains one of my all-time favorites. However, the mouse's weight is definitely noticeable, especially compared to newer, more weight-optimized ergo mice. That said though, this is expected for VAXEE, as their mice have traditionally been on the heavier side, and the added weight does contribute to the mouse's superb shell rigidity, which gives the mouse a very solid solid premium feel in the hand, though it can take a bit of time to adjust to the weight if you're coming from a lighter mouse. But to VAXEE's credit, the wireless tech here on the AXW, just as it was in the MP01W, is exceptionally well implemented, as performance is rock solid with flawless polar grid stability across the board, and while the mouse is capped at 4K Hz for now, with the 8K Hz update still pending, the overall responsiveness and consistency of the mouse's performance is excellent, on par if not actually slightly better than many modern mice despite its age. And in typical VAXEE fashion, the AXW's build quality is exceptional, as the shell feels solid as a rock with no creaking or flexing at all. Of course, that does come with some added weight as I mentioned earlier, but personally speaking, I quite like the heft of the mouse as it adds a unique sense of stability and control to the mouse. But that said, I do think the AXW might be too heavy for many users considering this mouse, and I do think that VAXEE could refine the weight on a future version a little bit while keeping the same degree of quality and feel. But aside from the mouse's weight, the click performance here in the AXW, as expected, is excellent, with the same crisp tactile main buttons we saw in the MP01W. The side buttons, while still uncoded, which I'm not exactly a fan of, do still feel responsive and well tuned, and the scroll wheel, though it is a little shallow in the shell, is smooth and very well implemented. But overall, once I adjusted to the AXW's unique weight, I really enjoyed using its shape again, and I performed very well on it, but the mouse does show its age in some areas, not necessarily in a way that would negatively impact its performance, but it does feel a little different compared to more modern releases. Because of this, I'd love to see VAXEE give the AX the same V2 treatment they gave the MP01, as a slightly lighter AX shape with updated internals and side buttons and a few other refinements would make an incredible mouse. But despite the potential improvements here, the AXW is still a great mouse, one I really enjoyed using and one I performed very well on due to its incredible shape, but the mouse definitely shows its age in some aspects, which makes it a little tricky to recommend compared to more modern releases like the E1 and other ergo mice that are available on the market. For build quality, as I mentioned earlier and as expected for a VAXEE product, the Outset AXW's build quality is exceptional, as the shell feels solid as a rock with no creaking or flexing anywhere on it, and even when I apply a significant amount of force to the shell remains completely rigid, which is very impressive considering my unit is second hand. The mouse's internal build quality is just as impressive, as the mouse uses the same cage-like design we've seen them use on their previous models. Admittedly, it is a little bit complex on the inside, but it is very well engineered, and the soldering on the PCB is flawless with no noticeable issues. And the Outset AXW's quality control matches its build quality, as all of its buttons feel perfectly implemented with consistent tensioning across each button, and I didn't notice any inconsistencies with any of the mouse's buttons over my testing. And keep in mind that this is a second-hand unit, which makes the build quality in QC even more impressive, as the mouse's quality and functionality has held up through multiple users, which is something you can't really say about a lot of other brands, but something I would arguably say is expected for a VAXEE product. In terms of weight, the Outset AXW, as I mentioned earlier, is a heavier mouse, which is advertised by VAXEE as weighing 73 grams, which makes sense given its age and its rock-solid build quality and internal structure. Now, since my unit is missing the stock skates, my unit measures at 71.1 grams, but seeing as VAXEE's full-size skates generally weigh around 1.9 grams, the mouse's stock weight, if I had the stock skates, would come out to exactly 73 grams, exactly as advertised, which is a refreshing thing to see given how many brands give completely inaccurate weight estimates nowadays. Now, while the AXW is heavier than many more modern ergonomic mice, this extra heft isn't necessarily a bad thing, as I mentioned earlier, as it gives the mouse a sense of stability in the hand, though it can take some time to get accustomed to it if you're coming from a lighter mouse. Now, personally speaking, I enjoyed the heft of the mouse, but I can definitely understand why a lot of users pass over this mouse considering its weight. As I said earlier though, looking forward, if VAXEE ever gives the Outset series a V2 treatment like they did the MP01, I'd love to see the mouse's weight tuned down to more around the 60 to 65 gram range, as that weight, while still on the heavier side for a gaming mouse, would be more in line with the weight ranges we see on more modern ergonomic gaming mice. For axis balancing, the Outset AXW is centrally balanced as you'd expect for an ergonomic shape. However, the balancing here is more of a balancing point rather than the ranges we've seen pop up on many more modern ergo mice. Now this balancing point sits roughly at the sensor's location around the 83mm mark, roughly at the midpoint of the mouse's 116mm length, and aligned with the mid-forward region of the mouse's rear side button. Now having a tighter balancing point does make the AXW slightly less compatible for certain grip styles compared to lighter ergo mice with wider balancing ranges. That said though, the mouse's weight helps to compensate for this slightly, so even if your grip is centered above or below the balancing point, you're unlikely to notice any instabilities in its feel because of this. But while the mouse is centrally balanced on its x-axis, for y-axis balancing, just like the MP01W, the Outset AXW is slightly left heavy due to its ergonomic shaping, but the difference in the axis balancing is very minor, borderline negligible, but it's something I wanted to mention for the sake of thoroughness. For shape, the Outset AXW, as I mentioned earlier, is an ergonomic shape, similar-ish in dimensions to the MP01W, but the AXW has a taller shell with a more pronounced rounded tilt in true ergonomic fashion. Now due to this ergonomic shaping, this mouse is optimized for right-hand use only, as left-hand use isn't feasible due to the shell's tilt, and the side buttons aren't usable with this grip style either. For dimensions, the mouse's shell measures 116mm long. For width, at the front region of the shell measures 61mm wide at the top and 55mm wide at its base. At the mid region, the shell measures 62mm wide at its top and 60mm wide at its base, but it's worth noting at the upper mid region of the shell there is a very deep indentation in the side shell measuring 58.8mm wide. And at the rear region of the shell measures 59.8mm wide at the top and 66mm wide at its base. And for heights measured on the left and right side of the mouse's ergonomic shell, at the forward region of the shell, the right side of the mouse measures 26.6mm tall, where the left side measures 30mm tall. At the mid region of the shell, the right side measures 34.9mm tall, and the left side measures 43mm tall. And towards the rear region, the right side of the shell is 30.3mm tall, and the left side shell is 27.3mm tall. For shell profiles, the Outset AX is a rather unique ergo shape due to its larger, bulbous design, which unlike the Death Adder or other ergo shapes which have many clones, there aren't very many clones of the AXW shape, as the only mice that share similar-ish shapes are the Pulsar-chosen Zywu Medium, the Ponage Ergo, and the Lamzu Thorn, but even these shapes differ from the AX's shell in various ways. Now for the mouse's specific shell profiles, looking at the mouse from the top, we can see the AX's bulbous ergo shape, which initially is very reminiscent of the MP01 shaping, but with the tall, aggressive ergonomic tilt to the mouse's shell. Flipping the mouse over and looking at it from the base, we can clearly see the curvature of the AX's ergo shell, and we can also see that some areas of the shell are much thinner than the upper shell's profiles, hence the differencing in the width that we just talked about a moment ago. We can also see that the overall profile of the shell's curvature is more rounded and bulbous than many other ergonomic shells, specifically at the rear region, as it has very exaggerated flare-outs. Looking at the mouse from the sides, we can best see the mouse's hump shaping, which lacks the extreme sloping we commonly see on many ergo mice, and while its rear hump shaping is still sloped, it's less aggressive than we commonly see, and the hump's overall shaping is also taller, somewhat GPX-like in terms of its overall curvature, as it peaks towards the center of the mouse's physical midline. However, the overall shell is much taller due to the mouse's ergonomic nature. Looking from the AX from the front, we get our first look at the mouse's aggressive ergonomic tilt, which also affects the design of the shell buttons, and we can see that the mouse's side profiles are unsurprisingly quite unique, as the shell's left side right from the front is aggressively outwardly tilted and slightly curved. This outward curvature continues towards the mid region of the side shell and deepens at the side shell's indentation we mentioned earlier, and then inverts its shaping to be inwardly tilted towards the rear region of the left side shell. Whereas on the shell's right side left from the front, while it is still outwardly tilted, it's much slighter in its tilt and curvature, and unlike the opposite side where the profile deepens, the shell's right side is much more even, maintaining its shaping and curvature throughout the mid region, and this shaping continues until the end region of the right side shell, where just like its opposite side, it inverts to be inwardly tilted towards the end of the right side shell. And lastly, from the rear, we can best see the shell's ergonomic tilting, which has a more rounded profile than expected, and this profile peaks towards the shell's left side and then aggressively tapers off towards the shell's right side, and again we can see the rear shell's profile, which while sloped is much less aggressively sloped than we commonly see on many ergo mice, being a little more rounded and bulbous in terms of its shaping. 4 contact areas from a 25.4cm by 10.16cm hands using an angled claw grip here on the Outset AXW. Starting with the thenar region, the more bulbous shaping on the Outset AXW combined with the left side's flare-out creates a large contact area for my thenar, most notably in the low to mid region on my hand. For mid-palm contact, the taller, more rounded ergonomic hump creates a very spacious region, specifically towards the upper mid region of my hand, but it is worth noting that the contact is more pronounced towards the right side of my mid palm than the left, but this is due to my tilted grip. And lastly, for hypothenar contact, the wider, more aggressive ergonomic flare out on the mouse's right side creates a large ledge, so to speak, more so than many other ergonomic shapes do, which creates a large contact point for my hypothenar region, allowing all regions of my hypothenar to make solid contact with the shell when gripping it. For finger contact, starting with my thumb, it naturally rests towards the upper region to the left side shell, but if needed I can angle my thumb inward to rest it in the middle of the indentation in the left side. For my index and middle fingers, they rest towards the end region of the shell buttons, however since there is no groove or indentation in the buttons, they rest more towards the edges of the buttons than usual. And for my ring finger, it rests opposite of my thumb's natural position on the shell's right side, slightly above where the shell curves outward, and my pinky finger rests slightly below my ring finger, resting slightly below the aforementioned outward curvature point. For estimates in hand size and grip style compatibility here for the Outset AXW, due to the mouse's larger size and unique ergo shape, the mouse isn't as universally compatible as the MP01 or MP01S was, and also keep in mind that because the shells are ergonomic, not asymmetrical like the aforementioned mice, the mouse is only compatible with right-handed grip styles. Now for hands measuring approximately 15 by 2 by 16.5 by 16.5 by 17.8 centimeters, the mouse is best suited for palm grips. For hands measuring 16.5 to 17.8 centimeters by 17.8 by 19.1 centimeters, the mouse is again best suited for palm grips. For hands measuring 17.8 to 19.1 by 19.1 by 21.8 centimeters, the mouse is compatible with both palm and claw grip styles. For hands measuring 19.1 to 20.3 by 21.8 to 22.9 centimeters, the mouse is again best suited for palm and claw grips. For hands measuring 20.3 to 21.6 by 22.9 to 24.1 centimeters, the mouse is best suited for claw grips. For hands measuring 21.6 to 22.9 by 24.1 to 25.4 centimeters, the mouse is again best suited for claw grips. And for hands measuring 22.9 to 26.7 by 25.4 by 29.2 centimeters, the mouse is again best suited for claw grips. Now technically speaking, you can use a fingertip grip here with the AXW, but due to its shaping and weight, while it is usable, it's not exactly recommended. But as always, this is a rough estimation, and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility here for the AXW will vary from person to person. So if you're considering this mouse, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your fingertips to just below your wrist line, and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your knuckles, excluding your thumb, and you can use those measurements to estimate if your hand size and grip style is compatible here with the AXW. And for coating, the Outset AXW is using the exact same coating type we've seen VAXEE use on many of their previous models, including the MP01 and MP01S, and this coating is a bit of an odd one as it's a semi-chalky coating, reminiscent of the coating Pulsar used on the White X2H, or a less grippy Feather Gen 3 coating from VAXEE, the one used in the OGM Pro V2. But despite the unique feeling, just like we saw in VAXEE's other mice, the coating here performed exceptionally well, and even with my sweatier hands I was able to keep a well-anchored grip on the mouse's shell, which was quite surprising. That said though, I still do think the coatings used by VAXEE, Endgame Gear, and Razer are better than the current VAXEE coating. However, the differences between these various coating types is minimal at best, and realistically the AXW's coating will perform well for most use cases. But if you do find the VAXEE coating to be slippery, especially if you have very sweaty hands, you can always use aftermarket grip aids such as the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wings V2 or Gecko's V2 and V3, as they can significantly improve the gripability of the mouse's shell, particularly the side buttons, in a non-intrusive form factor that doesn't significantly alter the shape of the mouse. For main clicks, the AXW uses the traditional VAXEE style clicks with the expected aggressive curvature to the ends of the buttons, but unlike the MP01's buttons, the AXW buttons are more rounded to match the shell's forward curvature, and the buttons themselves are also tilted slightly to match the ergonomic curvature of the shell. Another interesting aspect to the main clicks here is that their surface is more rounded than we've seen on previous VAXEE mice, being more rounded than we saw in the MP01 and 01S. Now, as expected, the buttons do lack any grooves or indentations in them, but on the plus side, the main clicks do share the same coating as the rest of the shell, which makes the buttons surprisingly grippable despite their unique rounded design. For stabilization, the main clicks are decently stabilized, but they do have a bit of wobble to them when you press them down. This is due to the unique anchoring mechanism VAXEE uses for their main clicks as they clip into their stabilizers, the same anchoring style we saw used on VAXEE's previous mice, and despite this unique mechanism, the main clicks still feel quite good and are well anchored, and the wobbling never affected their performance. And just like we've seen in VAXEE's other mice, the main clicks are indented into the shell, which helps prevent fingers resting against the mouse's sides from interfering with the click's actuation, but in typical VAXEE style, the indentation here is a gap, not a walling like we commonly see on most mice. This gapped indentation does mean in some rare cases, fingers that rest on the upper edges of the sides of the mouse can interfere with the click's actuation. However, this is a very rare case, and the clicks will be free of interference issues for most if not all grip styles. Now for click heights, due to the ergonomic nature of the AXW shell, the two buttons have different click heights, as the taller left button measures 26.7mm tall at its top region, 32.8mm tall at its mid region, and 38.9mm tall at its end region, while the shorter right button measures 24.1mm at its top region, 29.8mm at its mid region, and 25.1mm at its end region. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test of the AXW's main clicks. Inside, the mouse uses the same switches that we saw used on the MP01S and several of VAXEE's other mice, the Wano black shell pink dot switches. These switches are a variant of the ever popular blue shell transparent pink dot switches, but they have a firmer, higher actuation weight, being around 80 to 90 grams instead of the 60 to 70 grams found on the transparent shelled versions, and this increased actuation weight does give the AXW's clicks a firmer but more balanced click feel, and these pink dot switches do have a much stronger, snappier rebound than the transparent versions, but the improved click feel on these switches does come at a cost, as these switches are only rated for 10 million cycles while the transparent shelled versions are rated for 80 million cycles. On the topic of actuation weight, it's worth noting that depending on where you click on the shell buttons, the actuation weight of the clicks does increase slightly, as at the top to mid region of the buttons, the actuation weight is within the expected 80 to 90 gram range, but towards the mid to end region of the buttons, the clicks are stiffer, feeling more around the 90 to 100 gram range, so keep this in mind if you'd like to click towards the end region of the shell buttons, as the clicks here on the AXW will be a little heavier in this case. Now in terms of travel, both the main clicks share the same medium range of pre-travel and post-travel, which is expected for a VAXEE mouse due to their click design, and the buttons, as I mentioned earlier, do have a very firm, snappy rebound, which allows the main clicks to be quite spammable despite their higher actuation weights. And as a final note regarding the main clicks here, as expected for a VAXEE mouse, you can adjust the debounce timing of the main clicks between 2, 4, and 6 milliseconds via the WebDriver or the onboard controls. Now personally speaking, I use 0 ms for the majority of my testing, and I didn't run into any issues with double clicking or any other debounce related issue, but feel free to set this value to whatever you would like and adjust it as needed. For side buttons, the Outset AXW uses a traditional button style we've seen VAXEE use for most if not all of their mice to date, which is both a positive and negative thing, as while the buttons are very well implemented, they share the same faults as VAXEE's previous side buttons. But before we talk about the buttons themselves, let's talk about positioning, as the AXW side buttons are positioned slightly forward of the mouse's physical midline and balancing point by a few centimeters, which allows both side buttons to be accessible with most hand sizes and grip styles. Now the first fault with the side buttons here is that they are side by side with no gapping between them. This means that if you press towards the inner edges of the button, specifically on the rear side button, it's very easy to accidentally actuate the opposite button. Now admittedly this might not be an issue for all users, but it is a big problem for users like myself who have big wide fingers. Now the buttons themselves are quite similar in their shaping and sizing to the ones found in the MP01, having a slightly more pronounced curved pill-like shaping with a pointed end and a rounded surface. They also share the same pronounced as we we've seen from VAXEE side buttons before, as the buttons jut out from the AXW side shell quite a bit, more so than most side buttons I've seen to date, which further improves their usability. But unlike the rest of the shell, and as we've seen on VAXEE's previous mice, the side buttons oddly don't share the same coating as the rest of the mouse's shell, as they're a glossy plastic, which can be quite slippery to grip due to their rounded surface. This is the other fault with the AXW side buttons and all of VAXEE side buttons in my opinion, as during more intensive use, these side buttons can be very slippery when exposed to any kind of moisture, and this further worsens the misactuation issues I mentioned earlier, as your fingers can easily slip misactuating the opposite button. Now to be fair, the experience here might be better with drier hands, but from my experience with VAXEE side buttons with my sweatier hands, it's been a mixed bag historically speaking. I have yet to figure out why VAXEE has kept this style of side button for so long, as it's arguably been my biggest gripe with our mice to date, but if in the future we see an Outset AX V2, these buttons could be improved by flattening their surface, adding a gap between them, and applying an actual coating to their surface. This way the side buttons would not only be easier to grip, but they'd also be less prone to misactuation issues due to the added gapping between them. But aside from the interesting design of the side buttons here, to VAXEE's credit, the side buttons are very well stabilized with only a slight degree of play to them, and the buttons don't have too much of a tilt or wobble to them, which is nice to see. Now in terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test of the side buttons. Inside, and just as we saw with the AXW's main clicks, the mouse uses what appear to be the same Wano black shell white dot micro switches we've seen used on all of VAXEE's previous mice's side buttons. Now due to their unique design, I could be wrong, as they could be a Chenfeng switch or another brand switch, but from my experience with them, they perform closest to a Wano black shell white dot micro switch, hence why I'm referring to them as such. Now if they are the switch I think they are, they'll have a cycle rating of 5 million cycles, but if it's another brand switch, the cycle rating will be higher or lower. But regardless of the switch's brand, these switches are on the heavier side as expected for a VAXEE mouse's side buttons, but not to the same degree as the main click switches, as they're ever so slightly lighter, being around the 65 to 75 gram range for their actuation weight, and both the side buttons share the same low degree of pre and post travel, which can be lengthened slightly if you press the side buttons in firmly, and both side buttons also have a rather snappy rebound, but it's not as strong as the main click switches due to the smaller physical side of the side button switch, but it's enough to keep the side buttons decently spammable. For scroll wheel, the wheel is made of plastic, but unlike the usual design we commonly see where the plastic is raised around a rubber texturing on other mice, the entire surface of the AXW scroll wheel is rubber with no raised plastic texturing around it, as we've seen on VAXEE's previous mice. And the rubber texturing here has that signature VAXEE styled sneaking linear texturing running across it, which is quite grippy and makes utilizing the mouse's scroll wheel and wheel click quite easy. However, due to the ergonomic shell here, the scroll wheel itself is quite shallow, being much shorter than the wheels found on the MP01 and 01S. On those mice I can scroll up to 10 points, whereas here on the Outset I can only scroll to 7 points. Now to be fair, this shorter range doesn't significantly impact the mouse's gaming use case, but it does slightly affect the mouse's usage for scrolling and editing. Now inside, as expected for a VAXEE mouse, it uses the same ALPS 7mm 24-step encoder we've seen used on VAXEE's other mice, and since the previous owner did use a scroll wheel quite a bit, my wheel has been quite worn down, so it feels a little loose, but since this is the same encoder as the one used on the MP01S, we can use that mouse as a reference point for how the scroll wheel encoder is supposed to feel. Now this ALPS encoder naturally has a heavier scroll force and rather pronounced scroll points, which gives the scroll a very tensioned, controlled feeling, which is expected due to its mechanical nature. However, the encoder will loosen over time and overuse, resulting in a slightly weaker scroll force and scroll points, which is what's happened here on my second-hand mouse. Now for the scroll wheel click, the Outset AXW is using the same Wano black shell white dot micro switch that we saw used for the mouse's side buttons, and compared to the plunger style clicks we've seen dominate the market lately, this feels much better in my opinion, and while it does have a heavier actuation weight being around the 65 to 75 gram range, it is still a relatively easy click to utilize and has a surprisingly good rebound as well compared to pillar switches, which is great to see. And as an added benefit, due to the mechanical encoder and its more tensioned tensioned nature helps prevent it having misactuation issues with the scroll wheel when scroll wheel clicking, and this applies to both my factory fresh MP01S and my pre-owned VAXEE mice, as mechanical encoders, while they do loosen up a little bit, still maintain their more tensioned nature compared to other encoders I've had experiences with, which is another great attention to detail here from VAXEE. For sensor, the Outset AXW is using the previous generation PixArt 3395 DMT6QU SKU, which, just like VAXEE's other 3395s, were developed in partnership with PixArt. Now previously, this sensor only supported 400, 800, 1600, and 3200 DPI levels, but with the latest firmware update, the sensor has been unlocked, so you can now use the sensor's full 100 to 26,000 DPI range, which is adjustable via 50 DPI steps instead of the preset values I just mentioned. The sensor also has motion sync enabled, but there is no ripple or angle snapping, which is expected, and the sensor supports two LOD levels, which are a little different from the standard 1 and 2mm levels we commonly see, as instead the sensor supports a low mode which tracks at 0.4 to 0.9mm, and a high mode which tracks at 0.8 to 1.4mm. And for MCU, unlike most high-performance mice which use Nordic MCUs, the mouse is using a Pixar MCU, specifically the PAR2862QC. Now normally a non-Nordic MCU would raise some red flags, as I've had some pretty bad experience with wireless mice using non-Nordic MCUs before, but since both the MP01 and 01S perform flawlessly over my testing and they use the same MCU, the unique MCU choice here on the Outset AXW isn't a concern, and over my testing I didn't run into any issues with the mouse's MCU or sensor on any of the mouse's high polling rates. Now for sensor positioning, the sensor is centrally positioned in the mouse's shell, being around 2mm forward of the mouse's 58mm midline, roughly at the 60mm mark in the shell, which is roughly aligned with the mouse's balancing point. Now normally a forward sensor position would affect the mouse's feel and performance, but since the sensor is so slightly forwardly positioned, it won't significantly impact the performance of the mouse in any way. I also wanted to mention that just like we've seen on VAXEE's other mice, the AXW supports both a standard and competitive mode, which offer various performance benefits in combination with VAXEE's fantastic wireless tech, which, as I talked about in review of the MP01S and NP01, is fantastically implemented and is arguably one of, if not the best wireless techs available on the market, but we'll talk more about the wireless tech and these performance modes later in this video. Now, while I didn't experience any issues with the mouse's sensor over my testing, this is another area where the mouse does show its age a little bit, and on a Outset AX V2, I'd love to see VAXEE update the sensor to the 3950, as that sensor would further improve the mouse's already great performance and add support for sensor tilting, which is a very underrated feature that is very useful here on VAXEE's mice. Now, as expected given the 4K dongle that was included with the AXW, and as I just mentioned, the high polling rate implementation here is fantastic as expected, though with the most recent firmware update, the mouse's polling rate has actually been changed and will likely be changed again in the future. Now, in terms of report ranges, over the 2.4 GHz wireless connectivity, the mouse supports 500Hz to 4000Hz, and over the wired connectivity, the mouse only supports 500Hz to 1000Hz. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, and despite the unique MCU choice, all the AXW's connectivity types and their respective polling rates were very well implemented, and in combination with the mouse's competitive mode, the mouse performed exceptionally well, which is to be expected for a VAXEE mouse. Now, while the AXW and the MP01W currently cap out at 4K Hz, VAXEE did confirm a while ago that all the 4K versions of their mice will be receiving a future firmware update that will add 8K Hz polling. Now, as of recording this video, we still don't have an ETA for that update, but hopefully it'll be released in the coming months. Now, admittedly, I do wish VAXEE's mice supported the same report rates over their wired connectivity as they did on wireless, but seeing as VAXEE's wireless tech is the closest thing to wired performance I've seen to date, this isn't the biggest issue, but it would be nice to see wired high polling rate support on the Outset AX V2 and VAXEE's other future mice. For battery, the AXW uses the same 400mAh battery type we've seen VAXEE use on many of their previous mice, which uses a 2mm 3-pin JST connector. Now, according to the AXW's product page, VAXEE estimates that the mouse will last 100 hours on 1kHz using the standard mode, around 55 hours on 1kHz in competitive mode, 45 hours on 2kHz using the competitive mode, and 35 hours on 4kHz using competitive mode. Now, from my testing, setting the AXW to its max DPI range of 26 26,000 and placing it on a mouse jiggler to simulate constant motion on both competitive modes. On 1K Hz in standard mode with motion sync off, the mouse's runtime was 91.5 hours, whereas on 1K Hz in competitive mode with motion sync off, the mouse's runtime dropped to 44.2 hours. On 2K Hz in the competitive mode with motion sync off, the mouse's runtime was 39.4 hours, and on 4K Hz in the competitive mode with motion sync off, the mouse's runtime was 32.4 hours. And from my estimations, when the 8K Hz polling update is released, the runtime on 8K Hz in the comp mode should be around 25 hours, but the battery life on the 8K Hz will likely vary, so we'll have to wait for the update to be released to get some definite values. But overall, the mouse's battery is good considering the mouse's age. It's slightly shorter than the estimated values, but seeing as the mouse is second in and has been used before, this is to be expected. Of course, more modern mice will have much better runtimes, but keep in mind the AXW's age, so it's not exactly a fair comparison, and if VAXEE does ever end up making a V2 with the Outset AX, that mouse will likely launch with more competitive runtimes. Now, one last note I wanted to make here, just like we saw in the MP01 and 01S, the battery is a very specific size, meaning that you can't mod in a larger battery due to how it's anchored inside the shell. You could technically mod in a smaller battery, but that will impact the overall runtime of the mouse, and considering the stock battery is already quite light, modding in a smaller, more compact battery won't really benefit the mouse from a weight perspective, so keep this in mind if you are considering weight modding this mouse, as a lot of the mouse's weight is due to the shell, not its components. Now, before I talk about software, you can use VAXEE's WebDriver on all of their 4K mice as of their latest firmware update. So to utilize the WebDriver and unlock the mouse's sensor, you'll need to update your mouse's firmware, which you can do via the guide VAXEE posted on their website, and I'll have that guide linked down in the video description along with the URL for the WebDriver. Now, just like all other web-based softwares, it only supports usage through Chromium-based browsers such as Edge and Chrome, and once you go to the software's URL, you can click on the connect button in the middle of the screen, select your mouse from the drop-down menu, and you'll load into the WebDriver. Now, this driver is split into 4 tabs, which you can toggle via the top bar here. The software also has a HUD of sorts, which displays the mouse's connectivity status, the mouse's battery level, and shows how long the mouse's runtime will be, as well as its estimated charging time, which is an incredible feature I'm shocked no other brands have implemented yet. This HUD also shows the mouse's driver version and a button to check the mouse's firmware, which will auto-download a new version if there is one, and a button to select the software's language, as well as a toggle button to clear the cache and a light and dark mode option, which was recently added. Now, in the first tab, the software displays a quick overview of the mouse's settings, such as its DPI, click latency, polling rate, LOD, motion sync status, and the mouse's mode, either competitive or standard. In the next tab, you can adjust the mouse's DPI and DPI levels. Again, with this firmware update, you can also set the DPI anywhere from 100 to 26,000 via 50 DPI steps instead of the predetermined 4, 800, 1600, and 3200 preset values. You can also disable these extra levels and use just one if you'd like, and you can also adjust the mouse's click latency or debounce here and set that to 0, 2, or 4 milliseconds, and you can also set the mouse's polling rate here as well. In the next tab, you can select the mouse's tracking mode between 4 options: competitive mode with motion sync off, standard mode with motion sync off, competitive mode motion sync on, and standard mode motion sync on. Now, the standard mode is, as it's named, is best used for standard use, while the competitive modes, while they use more power, significantly boost the performance of the mouse, offering superior click latency, better transmission rates, real-time tracking, and improved anti-interference tech compared to the standard operating modes. And when combined with the 2 or 4K polling rates, this competitive mode allows the mouse to perform near to how a wired mouse would perform in many aspects, and give the mouse and VAXEE's other mice fantastic overall performance, as I've mentioned already. But it is worth noting that in either of the standard modes, you can't use any report rates over 1K Hz, and when using the mouse wired, you can only use the competitive modes. And also in this tab, we can also adjust the mouse's LOD level between low 0.4 to 0.9 millimeters and high 0.8 to 1.4 millimeters. And in the last tab, we have the new custom keys tab, where you can adjust the binding of the mouse's buttons. Now, currently the options are a little limited and there's no option to change profiles on the mouse, but I'm sure we'll see more options added in the future. Now, in terms of repairability, given that this is a VAXEE mouse, the serviceability of the mouse is a bit of a mixed bag due to how complex the internal build is, but it is still serviceable to a degree. Opening the mouse is even tricky, as the mouse uses torque screws on its base, which require a specific size bit to remove, but once those are removed, the rest of the screws inside the mouse are standard Phillips heads bits of varying sizes. But due to the complexity of the internals, I'd recommend against taking the mouse apart further, as it's very easy to damage several of the internal components and and the ribbon cables. However, if you need to service a component on the inside, such as replacing the battery or modding out the mouse's switches, you can do so. You just need to be very careful. And if you're interested in servicing this mouse and learning how to safely disassemble it and reassemble it, as well as learning more about the mouse's internal structure, individual component weights, and more, you can check out the Outset AX's teardown video, which will be going live in a couple days. And lastly, for cable, the Outset AXW uses the same cable type we saw used on the MP01 and 01S, which is the traditional USB A to C type, but it features the aforementioned pronging on the USB-C end. Now, these extra prongs on the side physically slot into the mouse, which helps to prevent the cable from disconnecting if the cable gets caught on something. This is a very underrated feature that works very well, and I'm very happy to see it return here on the AXW. However, this design does prevent the cable from being usable with other mice, but on the plus side, the mouse's USB-C port is universal and compatible with most third-party cables. Now, the cable itself is actually a surprisingly good cable. It is definitely on the thicker side, but it's thin enough to be usable with mouse bungees, and the cable's wrapping is pretty smooth and low friction, so won't add too much drag if it's dragged across the mouse pad, but despite this, I'd still recommend using a bungee, and the cable's also quite flexible, which is a nice thing to see. And on top of all of this, the cable even has a tilted USB-C end, which further reduces any drag caused by the cable. So if you want to use the Outset AX wired, you can do so without any negative issues from the cable, but again, keep in mind the mouse is capped to 1 kHz on its wired connectivity, so using it wireless will be the better use case for this mouse. Alright, well, in closing, overall the VAXEE Outset AX, despite being an older VAXEE product, is still a very impressive mouse due to its legendary shape, amazing build quality, and surprising performance. But the mouse's last-gen specs, weight, and confusing side button design does make the mouse hard to recommend in today's market, which pains me to say as the AXW shape is insanely good. But seeing as the MP01 recently got a refreshed V2 version, I hope that VAXEE gives the Outset the same treatment as an Outset AX V2 with modern specs, improved weight, support for wired and wireless 8K polling, and improved side buttons would be an insane mouse, and I truly hope that VAXEE refreshes the Outset as this shape deserves a refresh. But we'll have to wait and see what VAXEE's plans are for the Outset, and we'll also have to see whether the E1 can rival the Outset as it uses more updated specs but a brand new ergo shape, but that will be a video for another time. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much for watching, and a big thank you to all of our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you would like to support my efforts here on the channel, consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support my efforts here, and being a channel member also gives you early access to all upcoming content. But with that, that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching my review of the VAXEE Outset AX Wireless, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.